Following on from my previous video, and before we go any further, let's clear up one urban myth. The antiques and vintage trade is not fading quietly into obscurity. What it is doing is undergoing one of the sharpest, most misunderstood transformations, or evolutions if you prefer, in its recent history. What I'm saying is this. While some dealers cling to the old ways of doing things and moan about decline, a new reality, driven by the younger generation, is forming all around them, fueled by shifting buyer psychology, global demand, technology, and digital platforms. To address this contradiction between the old and the new, I've done some research, and I can now present to you the 6 most relevant questions people in the trade are asking right now. These are the questions that cut through the noise, question our reality, and force us, the trade, to confront where we're headed next. So today, we're exploring the potential for market growth and economic opportunity in the antiques and vintage trade. Here's the first, most commonly asked question I could find when I did my research.
Are antiques and vintage markets genuinely growing, with fresh buyers and new money coming in? Or are we, as dealers, just convincing ourselves it's growing because we're seeing more social media posts and more online selling platforms being launched?
Let me be clear on my opinion right from the outset. Based on my research, the market is not dying or even declining. However, what is disappearing is lazy sourcing, blinded nostalgia, and the outdated assumption that antiques should behave exactly as they did 20 years ago. In my opinion, growth still exists, but it has changed shape, direction, and comes with a different expectation, particularly for the younger up-and-coming generation of dealers. We are no longer operating in a world where, in isolation, quantity equals success. And what I mean by that is, volume without curation is now a weakness, not a strength. So, based on available data, the market appears to be polarising or splitting into 2 camps. At the bottom end of the market, poorly presented, generic, oversupplied items are stalling. That's true to say. At the top end of the market, well-chosen pieces with design relevance, rarity and narrative are experiencing stable or even rising demand. Mid-century design, brutalism, studio ceramics, campaign furniture, industrial heritage and functional decorative objects continue to perform well because they align with contemporary interior design, modern psychology, and en vogue or fashionable storytelling. None of these niches are dusty remnants. They've all become cultural anchors repurposed for today's living requirements. And herein, I believe, lies a misunderstanding which is deeply rooted in perception. Many old-school dealers confuse slower traditional shop footfall with overall collapse. In my humble opinion, and I may be wrong of course, that is a basic failure of observation. The footfall and money haven't vanished. They've migrated to digital spaces, private collectors, interior designers, and a younger generation who value originality over landfill tat and reproductions. So if your stock still mirrors what sold in 2005, you're not unlucky, you're basically strategically obsolete. So growth is happening, but only for those prepared to track demand rather than romanticise the past. And the uncomfortable truth? The evolution of the trade doesn't ask you for permission. It just happens and quickly passes you by unless you analyse and respond to market trends. Our next most commonly asked question is,
are the younger generation even vaguely interested in antiques anymore? Or, as dealers, are we simply kidding ourselves? Is there really a new generation of buyers coming through? Or are we working in an aging market that's slowly shrinking as the traditional old-time buyers disappear?
In my opinion, yes. Younger buyers are interested in antiques, and perhaps more importantly, they're particularly interested in design-led vintage items. However, I have to admit it's true that younger buyers don't generally think like stereotypical collectors. And I think that that's where many traditional established dealers miss the point. The younger demographic of buyers is driven by identity expression, sustainability, uniqueness, and visual impact. They don't care whether an item qualifies as true antique. They care whether it feels authentic, visually distinctive, and meaningful within their own unique world. And whether we like it or not, social media platforms have played their part in transforming the way value is perceived. For example, a 19th century console table might sit unsold for years in a shop, but sell instantly if styled correctly in a modern interior setting on Instagram. The sharp lesson is context creates desire, presentation builds narrative, and narrative sells, especially to the younger generation. In this respect, it's true that young people aren't therefore visiting traditional antique centres in their droves, but they are out there. They're just somewhere else. They're discovering their pieces via reels, Pinterest boards, YouTube walkthroughs, hauls, and styled home tours. Therefore, if your business exists only in a physical space without digital storytelling, I'm afraid to break the news to you that you are completely invisible to them. So, based on my research, the evidence points to the fact this is not an aging market. It's a misinterpreted one. Buyers still exist, including the misunderstood younger generation. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you are speaking their language or shouting into yesterday's vacuum. The next most commonly asked question, I think, is really interesting.
Given the current economic climate we're all operating in, rising costs, tighter spending, and a lot of uncertainty, is working in the antiques and vintage trade starting to feel like a gamble? Is it still a sensible career to get into, or even stay in? Or has the risk tipped too far one way for anyone without deep pockets or decades of experience to survive?
Well, it doesn't take a genius to realise that every economic downturn exposes weaknesses. The current economic downturn is doing so at speed, and let's face it, with little or no mercy or consideration for those dealers who I've pointed out already are not evolving with market trends. Costs are rising. Consumer caution has increased. Impulse spending has tightened. And while in my opinion the business risk itself has not necessarily expanded, I do agree it has become more visible. And what do I mean by that? Well, I don't think anyone can argue that transparency now dominates the marketplace. Just take a look online, where, for example, websites and auction comparisons often highlight inflated or speculative pricing intended to exploit naive or ill-prepared buyers. As well as that, badly run antiques and vintage businesses stand out like a sore thumb, especially with misleading listings, inefficient customer service, and poor communication. And this is now reflected in Google reviews and customer feedback that anyone can access before committing to make a purchase. Don't say I didn't warn you. At the same time, strong, efficient, and forward-thinking businesses are not struggling in an industry vacuum. They are adjusting purchasing policies, refining stock flow, reducing deadweight inventory, and strengthening brand identity. They are not gambling on hope. They are deliberately engineering resilience into their business. The weakest, most vulnerable businesses rely on inconsistent sourcing, sentimental purchasing, bloated overheads, and emotional attachment to stock. These models will always fail in tightening economies, especially in recession. This is not news to seasoned economists. It's simply confirming their brutal rules and is unforgiving to say the least. So what I'm saying is recession or economic downturns don't erase opportunity. They relocate it. Those businesses with strategy, control, and clarity expand quietly, proving that market awareness, research, and the use of technology brushes aside complacency. So if your operation depends on nostalgia and luck, yeah, risk is rising. If it is built, however, on strategic thinking, precise research, and industry foresight, the current challenging economic landscape can in fact become an advantage. Our next most commonly asked question is subtle, and some of you might say obvious, but it's really important if you're dealing in antiques and vintage.
Some pieces I buy fly off the shelves and can even triple in value, while others, just as old or well made, barely get a second glance. So, what's making the difference? Is it the story behind the item, the rarity, the craftsmanship, or just changing tastes in the market? How can I, as a dealer, spot the pieces that are actually going to appreciate and avoid the ones that will just gather dust?
Let's start the answer to this question by removing the all-important element of fantasy. Value growth is traditionally driven by a combination of scarcity, condition, cultural relevance, provenance, and that most elusive factor, timing. I'd suggest to you that emotion plays no role in market price movement beyond, let's say, its somewhat sketchy influence it can have on trends. And what do I mean by that? Well, I would propose that objects rise in value when they reconnect with current aesthetics or even tap into generational nostalgia, like action figures or comics. I was always told as a golden rule that items come back into fashion about 30 years after they first appeared, as a result of nostalgic adults wanting to buy back or re-own their childhood. Now, putting my money where my mouth is, we'll see how I get on with my own personal investment made 20 years ago into carded, mint condition 1980s action figures. I'll let you know whether I make any money or not in about 10 years' time. Anyway, setting my personal investment woes to one side, items linked to strong craftsmanship, cultural nostalgia, historical narrative, or design movements that cycle back into favour seem to perform strongest in the current market. Mid-century modern being a perfect current example. So what I'm saying is the idea that everything old automatically gains value over time is commercially naive. How many of you are sat on old friends that have been stored for years while you wait for the buyer at the end of the rainbow to come along and pay you that dream price? I'd hazard a guess it's quite a few of you, me included. The big question, therefore, is what items will increase in value? In my opinion, pieces that appreciate in value aren't necessarily rare or scarce. They usually sit at the intersection of rarity and cultural desirability. In other words, scarcity without demand translates into storage. Demand without scarcity can be temporary hype, and these trends can come to an end in an instant. I always think back to the time I got stuck with 30 Victorian school desks after everyone who wanted a desk had bought one. Luckily, they were still in demand in Belgium of all places, and I was able to sell my job lot to a Belgian dealer on his annual buying trip to the UK. Lucky me. So what I'm saying is sustainable price appreciation lives where scarcity, quality and demand merge, and not in short-term transient fads or trends. It's also true to say that design cycles recycle constantly. What was ignored 20 years ago may become essential today, where taste gurus or TikTok influencers reframe it. So, sustainable interior design movements, architectural influences, cinematography, and social nostalgia can all shape perceived worth. The trick is to distinguish the sustainable from the transient, and therein can lie the difference between the citizen dealer taking a punt based on antiques TV programmes and the well-researched professional dealer who has studied the market over many years. So if your valuation method relies on TV sound bites, sentiment or assumption, you are speculating, not trading. In contrast, and in defence of experienced dealers, years of experience, knowledge and research can build leverage, which combined with observation and research into market trends can create or generate profit. Coming in at number 5 on our list of most commonly asked questions is,
I'm seeing more and more antiques and vintage pieces sold online, and it's a mixed bag. On one hand, it opens up access to buyers worldwide and can help move stock quickly. But on the other hand, it seems like some of the history and authenticity is getting lost, with fakes, reproductions, and misattributions slipping through the net. So I keep asking myself, is online selling actually helping the trade grow? Or is it slowly eroding the authenticity that makes antiques and vintage valuable in the first place?
Well, the answer to that is short and sweet. It's both. And denial of that fact won't change the reality of the situation. At the most basic of levels, online platforms dismantled geographic limitations, and surely no one can argue with that fact. For example, dealer websites, TikTok influencers, YouTube creators, eBay, Vinted and Etsy sellers, to name but a few, made dealing highly visible while simultaneously flooding the market with misattribution, inflated pricing and, unfortunately, I have to say, a significant degree of shallow knowledge. In this respect, the role of knowledge and authority in the trade has become an important differentiator that distinguishes the citizen dealer from the true professional. In fact, I'd propose that true authenticity as a dealer now lives in your ability to evaluate your stock and communicate its true value. At the end of the day, how you describe, photograph, contextualize and explain an object determines trust, which can translate into value and ultimately profit. In other words, the sellers who present clarity, expertise and honesty are building loyalty with their customer base. Those dealers who chase quick sales erode their credibility. As I've tried to explain, the internet hasn't weakened authenticity. Rather, it has had the opposite effect. It has exposed those dealers who genuinely don't possess authenticity and also those who rely on obfuscation, that's easy for me to say, to justify poor stock, misidentification and inflated prices. In this sense, the internet has made the trade more democratic, more transparent and more accountable. The strongest and most professional dealers treat digital presence as an extension of expertise, not a substitute for it. They educate, they inform. In fact, they position themselves as curators, not just retailers. Our final, most commonly asked question is,
when you take a step back and look at the antiques and vintage business today, do you see this sector as a viable marketplace that still has real long-term growth opportunity? Or is it becoming more of a passion-driven industry for wealthy people that's slowly fading away over time?
I would argue that the antiques and vintage trade is no longer exclusively a refuge for romantics with rose-tinted spectacles. It is, in fact, a competitive ecosystem with commercial expectations and a high degree of cultural relevance. So, in my opinion, career opportunities still do exist if your approach is the right one. But it is earned through strategic acquisition, sharp branding, disciplined pricing, and the use of modern communication tools. I would suggest that the era of passive income through long accumulated random stock and casual footfall has now ended. Success depends on authority, adaptability, and long-range planning. You must understand your market anticipate shifts, follow data, and interpret consumer psychology. This is not nostalgia retail. This is commercial curation. Those who approach the antiques and vintage trade as a business with identity will thrive. Those who treat it as a sentimental vocation will struggle and eventually disappear into irrelevance and obscurity. It's harsh to say, I know, but it's what I honestly believe. The future of the antiques and vintage trade favours precision, research, and integrity. It rewards intelligence, honesty, and transparency. It ignores stubbornness. So, in answer to the question, is the antiques and vintage trade still a career with long-term opportunity or just a fading passion industry? My answer is yes. It remains a genuine long-term opportunity, but only for those willing to adapt. The trade hasn't died, it has narrowed, sharpened, and professionalised. Experience and knowledge still, of course, matter. Provenance remains important and good stock still sells. But the routes to market, the buyers, and the expectations have changed. Those who treat it as a business, understand modern buyers, use digital platforms intelligently, and keep learning will find real opportunity. Those waiting for the past to return won't. The future of the trade belongs to the informed, the adaptable, and the disciplined. And in my opinion, that future is very much alive. So, my privilege as the content creator is to ask a final bonus question. Where is the antiques and vintage market actually heading? There's no doubt the antiques and vintage sector is undergoing structural change. Demand is not disappearing, it's transforming. Buyers are shifting away from bulk furniture and moving towards pieces that offer statement value, design individuality, or tactile craftsmanship. Smaller display spaces, modern housing, and lifestyle minimalism have reduced appetite for oversized heritage pieces. Instead, collectors focus on objects that integrate with modern environments. For example, lighting, ceramics, art glass, decorative metal items, and functional design pieces. It's also true that the rise of hybrid collectors, those who blend contemporary and antique, is reshaping demand. That's really important. They value contrast. They curate emotionally but purchase strategically. That's equally important, so I'll repeat it. Hybrid collectors curate emotionally but purchase strategically. In my opinion, this hybridization is where the strongest growth exists. Education-driven sellers will dominate future markets. Make no mistake of that. Those who explain origin, context, and historical relevance will outperform those who remain silent behind price tags. Trust becomes currency. Knowledge becomes positioning. The trade is not shrinking. It is selecting. So the industry isn't dying. Like an old snake, it's shedding its redundant skin. It's discarding outdated methods and forcing evolution through pressure. Those who interpret that pressure as decline will fall behind. Those who recognise it as transition will move forward with strength. Of course, you can cling to the comfort of the past, repeat tired narratives and blame economics. Or you can recalibrate, refine, modernise and dominate your niche with knowledge, transparency and authority. At the end of the day, the antiques and vintage market will continue to shape itself, regardless of sentiment or even what you hope for. It's not a question of whether it will survive or not. It will survive. The question is whether you are shaping your position within it. This is where resilience meets vision. This is where strategy outruns sentiment. This is where real opportunity in the antiques and vintage sector lives. And the market is watching. It's watching who adapts to change. not who fades quietly away. My name's Mark. Thanks for watching this episode of Antiques Central.